Before I get started on my presentation, I wanted to let you know some good resources, and I saw this book up here, so I'm sure you all probably heard about this. You know, at 35 bucks, you can get it online. It's really a good resource. I drew a lot of information for my presentation for that. Unfortunately, I don't have handouts of this. So the other thing I wanted to mention, I put out some publications outside on the little black roll table there. This is one, crop tree management. So this will be very applicable to what I'm talking about today. So it's a good reference and a resource. So some of the stuff that I'll be talking about, you can use this as a good follow-up. And then I also have a few, if you are in Kentucky, for the Forest Stewardship Program. This is a program through the Kentucky Division of Forestry. This is an opportunity to get a management plan for your property, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I have a small stack of those over there, and also some consulting forestry lists for here in Kentucky. So I'm sure Virginia has the same as well. But I just want to draw your attention to those. All right, so we're going to be talking about crop tree management and really managing the sugar bush. Now, when Shad asked me this, I'm like, Shad, I don't really know a lot about maple syrup, you know. They know more about it than I do. But I do know a bit about growing trees and trying to manage forests and the stuff. So in a lot of ways, it's really quite comparable, managing these maples. But really, in the past, most of our stuff's been managing oak. So I had to kind of flip my head a little bit around here. Most of the time, we're trying to kill red maple because it's taken over our oak trees. So, but again, crop trees are all about trees that meet your objectives. So a red maple can certainly be a crop tree. So in that spirit, we will press on. All right, so what I want to try to cover today in my little bit of time with you all is I'm going to go over crop tree management kind of at a pretty high level, but you do have that reference guide that you can tap into for additional resources. Talk a bit about sugarbush management. I want to identify the trees to tap, and I'm going to focus really on three of them, sugar, red, and box elder. I want to talk a little bit about the Forest Stewardship Plan because that's really an overall part of managing your property as well. And then I pulled some resources. The U.S. Forest Service does a continuous inventory of all the forests in the United States, and they do that in cooperation with the state forestry agencies. So every 5 years, each state is completely inventoried. Now, these inventory plots cover, like one plot covers 6,000 acres, representative of that. So some of the numbers you'll see might not make a little bit of sense. It just means because some of the trees weren't in those plots. But I just wanted to kind of get a feel, and I think you'll find it interesting, about what the maple resource on those three species are in Harlan, Letcher, and Wise counties. So we'll look at that at the end and kind of, and when y'all were talking about the association, I'm like, well, there's a lot of opportunities, certainly, and y'all will see that here in a minute. Okay, so what is the sugar bush? Really, it's just a forested area that's primarily used for maple syrup production. The key thing I want to drive home, it's not only sugar maples. You know, as you saw, there's other species. And here in Kentucky, we have, over 120 native tree species in the state. It's one of the great things about, I think, Kentucky and this region is the diversity of plants that we have, and certainly in trees is one of them. So that's another important thing I'll try to drive home is, you don't want to kill everything that's not a maple out there necessarily. So, sometimes leaving those oaks and those other things can be a good thing, especially from a long-term standpoint. Okay, some of the benefits of managing your sugar bush, and we've talked about this a little bit. Really, your best sap producers are going to be trees with really deep and wide crowns. So you'll see in a little bit, really, the bigger the crown, the more sap we're going to get. It maintains the health and the vigor of your trees, and it really allows you to improve your capacity to maximize your high quality and high sugar sap. So you're concentrating your growth on the trees that are going to serve you best in this practice of crop tree management. And ultimately, by doing that, you're going to reduce your cost of production and hopefully, in turn, improve your profitability. So which trees, and again, just in this area, are you going to be tapping largely? And I didn't put a silver maple on here, but certainly we could maybe learn more about that. Sugar maple is the big one that we talk a lot about. Red maple, this is the most numerous tree in Kentucky. If you counted every tree that was 1 inch or larger in Kentucky, there would be more of this species than any other, by far. It's really dominating a lot of our woods anymore. And then next, box elder. So I was glad to hear the good stuff about box elder because certainly you can get maple syrup out of any of the maple trees and the whole family of Acer. And there's others, you heard about silver, but there's black as well. And so there's some other trees out there that can get it, but I just wanted to focus on the ones that I found in this region here. And they covered just a little bit identifying the different maple trees, and I wanted to talk about there's a lot of different things we can use to identify which trees we're dealing with, and there's a number of different characteristics. And just like people, trees have characteristics, and we can use those to try to break down which tree we're looking at. So flowers, fruit, and location, those are all valuable, but I want to focus on the leaves, the bark, and the twigs, and the buds as well. And mentioned, again, leaf arrangement. So this is probably going to be one of your easier clues, especially in the winter, to try to look, or not leaf arrangement, but branching patterns and twig patterns, is the arrangement of them. So what we have here is what we call opposite. So that means the leaves are opposite of one another, and this will be a pattern that will persist throughout the tree. So you'll see it in branching, and you'll see it in twigs as well. The great thing about this is there's only a few species that have this branching pattern. And fortunately, maple is one of the big ones in this area. So this is an opportunity to really narrow down what you're looking at. So if it has that opposite branching and opposite leafing pattern, you know it's either going to be a maple, an ash, a dogwood, or a buckeye in this area. So that really narrows it down. So if you're not seeing that, then you can kind of rule that out, that it's one you might be interested in. And really, almost all the other species have this alternate pattern where the leaves and twigs will be alternate of one another. So here is a little red maple. So you can see here, see these little the leaves coming off there. So that's what I'm talking about, opposite one another. So that's a pattern, again, that'll persist in the branching, and you can see it if you look up in the tree. You'll be able to see that opposite repeatedly. Now, not every one of them is going to be opposite one another. There might be one that didn't grow on this side. But if you look throughout that tree and you repeatedly see this opposite one another, that's going to clue you in. It's going to be one of those species. And that'll help. And so let's talk a little bit more about the range. Hopefully you all can see that a little better than I can. This is the range of sugar maple. Now, these maps were put together a number of years ago. But you can see really all of Kentucky, and I think some of y'all were talking about the range of where these sugar maples occur. So you can see we're right in here. And so we're kind of at the southern point of the range of sugar maple. So looking at the leaves, typically they're 3 to 6 inches wide. One thing that you'll notice on these leaves is they don't have fine teeth, and that's going to be an easy way to distinguish a sugar maple from a red maple. Right here, it's kind of entire. There's no break or no teeth, and when I'll show you the red maple in a second, that'll be a little clearer. The bark, the bark is tough. It is so variable in these species, and it fools me sometimes as well. It's tough. The bark can be tough. It takes a lot of time and a lot of experience. But typically on sugar maples, when they're smaller in this 4 to 8 inches size, they're going to be a smooth gray. Eventually, they'll start developing furrows. And then they'll start getting these kind of plates and irregular ridges, and they'll start curling outward. Again, bark is tough. It really is tough. So look at the branching pattern. But this is a really good way to do it. These twigs are really a good way to distinguish one from another. What you'll see here is you got these nice pointy buds here. And what you can't see on the other side of this bud is there's another bud on the other side. So if you're looking at those twigs and you see those buds opposite of one another, then you've narrowed it down that it's either a maple, an ash, or a dogwood. And then you see this little bunch of terminal buds there at the end. That's a good one. So these are typically for the sugar maple. They're going to be pretty shiny, brownish, and sharply pointed. So that's going to be your clues on what you're looking at there. So looking at red maple range, you'll notice that range is much wider. It's huge. It really is. It is dominating. It is, like I said, the #1 tree species in terms of number here in Kentucky. Looking at its leaf, so remember I was telling you a little bit about the fine teeth that we didn't have on the sugar maple. Notice these little kind of fine teeth around the edges. So that's how you're going to distinguish the red maple from the sugar maple, is it'll have those fine teeth like that. And there is a lot of variability in really in all of these, but certainly red maple exhibits a lot of different variability in leaf shape and form. But again, the little fine teeth is going to be a good clue if you're only looking at the leaves. The bark, again, we're looking at, on small trees like this, it's kind of, you'll see a lot of times it's blotchy, light gray. It'll eventually start developing gray or black ridges. And then eventually it'll kind of get broad, scaly plates. Again, so much variability in the bark. It's a tough one if you're not really familiar looking at them to really try to identify But the twigs, notice the big difference between the twigs, between the sugar and the red maple. On this twig right here, you notice you got the blunt terminal bud. It's really red. Almost all the time they're going to be a bright kind of reddish color, and they're going to be shiny. So again, look at that opposite branching there, or where the leaves would come off. So looking at all those clues will help narrow the difference between the two. And then the next one's a little bit easier. The box elder. So that's got, it's also another common name for is Manitoba maple, just because it goes up into Canada, but it's got a wide range. And a lot of times we'll see this tree, again, like they said earlier, in riparian areas where it's nice and wet, it likes the water. It does have a lot of different variability in its leaf. It can have leaflets. Again, we mentioned it's a compound leaf. It can have 3 leaflets, all the way up to 7, and on a real rare occasion, you might see 9 individual leaflets. So when we're looking at compound leaves, this whole thing is a leaf, and these individual pieces here are leaflets. A lot of times I get asked in my job to identify trees, and a lot of times people will send me leaflets. And you're like, I'm not really sure what this is. So the way you tell what the whole leaf is you'll basically trace it back to the bud. So anything beyond that bud is going to be the leaf, whether it's a simple or compound. All right, so there's just another picture. This one here has 5 leaflets on it, I believe. And there's the bark on one, and again, a little bit of variability here, but it's going to be a thin, pale gray. It's going to have these shallow ridges. And if you see a really, really old one down on the river bottom, they can really get these really deeper furrows on them. And this, I'm sure, was probably somewhere nice and moist. But here, a big difference in the twigs and the buds on these. So look at this. This twig here is much more stout. The buds are a different color, kind of greenish, purplish, if you will. Oftentimes they'll be a little bit hairy, so there'll be a fine hair on those. So if you see the twigs, you know it's going to be an easy way to kind of distinguish one from another. And certainly in the winter, it's a good time to try to get that identification down. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we turn sunshine into maple syrup. And really, that's what it's all about. We take and we convert that sunshine and a little bit of water and CO2, and magic happens through photosynthesis, and we get some maple syrup eventually. So you start with sunlight and a little carbon dioxide. The tree pulls that in, mixes it with water, and some great chemical processes happen. And it converts that into a sugar. That sugar gets translocated down into the tree roots and converted into a starch for storage, and it feeds the tree over the next year as it comes up. And then as that spring, as the sap starts to rise, it brings all that sugar up with it, and that's what you all are tapping into. But ultimately what we're trying to do when we're doing management is we're trying to manage that crown. We want that crown to be as big and as healthy as possible. So we want to do practices that encourage that crown development. So when we're thinking about crop tree management, we're just selecting a limited number of trees. And the really thing I like about crop tree management is it's approachable. Because when you talk about managing your woods, it can be a little overwhelming when you see a whole hillside with all of these trees, and you're like, okay, I don't even know where to start with this. But using crop tree management, you can focus your efforts on a few trees and put your efforts there, and it will pay off for you. So what we're looking at in this picture right here is this is our little crop tree, and then these are all other trees that are not our crop tree. And you can see our crop tree's crowded right now, so it's not got a lot of room. But your objectives don't necessarily have to be just maple syrup. Certainly that's what we're interested in here today, but we may want to be interested in timber revenue. It can be a big one. Wildlife is another big one. And it can really vary. Whatever you all want with your property and want with your trees, crop tree management can allow you to kind of focus that energy and that effort and get that. But what we're trying to do in all of this is we're just trying to increase that growing space of that crown of our crop tree. So we're going to do practices that will kind of remove that competition. That's all crop tree management is removing competition from our crop trees. And we'll talk about how to go about that. So it really comes down to density. When our trees are packed real tight, they'll have a tendency to grow up nice and straight. And why would they be trying to go up nice and straight if it's tight? Yeah, they're trying to reach the sun. They're trying to get more sun. So that's their strategy, is to spend all their energy going up and getting taller to get sun. But we're trying to get these crowns big, because if we got big, deep, wide crowns, we're going to have more sap flow and hopefully more maple syrup. So by reducing the tree density, we'll expand the crowns, which will in turn produce more leaves, which will increase sap production, and ultimately, down the road, increases diameter growth. And a lot of times when I've recommended crop tree management, like I said before, we're doing it on oak trees. We're having a real problem maintaining our oaks in our forest right now. Some of that has to do with harvesting practices and other things. But the same principle applies to all of this, really. Any tree can benefit from crop tree management. Okay, so when you're thinking about a crop tree, again, I like this because it's an approachable thing. You're not thinking about every tree out there in the woods. You're just thinking about your crop trees. So one thing we're going to talk about is releasing different sides of the tree. And what you can think about is this little blue dot represents the stem, your main stem of your crop tree. And then we just break it up into 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then as we're assessing the tree, we're trying to see how many quadrants are free. Are all of its quadrants free? Now, free is more than just if they're not touching. So obviously, if your crowns are touching up there, there's competition happening. But if there's only about that much room or that much room, there's still a lot of competition happening because we're not getting enough sunlight down. So that would be competing with it as well. So this one's competing just as much as that one is competing as well. Now, another great thing about crop tree management, we're only really worrying about trees that are competing with the crowns. So if we have trees that are underneath, lower, and their branches and stuff are not competing with our crop tree, you don't have to spend time or effort messing with those trees because they are not competing with your crop tree. Again, it's all about you being efficient with your time and your efforts in the woods. We want those to be as productive for you as possible. Okay, so a lot of times we'll talk about different types of releases, and we've done a lot of studies on this, and the publication I've got out there for you on crop tree management talks about some of this research that we've done over the years, and Dr. Jeff Stringer at the UK Department of Forestry has done a lot of that work as well, and he's one of the authors on this. And what they were able to find is that different trees will respond differently to different amounts of release. Some of our trees, like the state tree of Kentucky, the yellow poplar, it does really good if you release all 4 sides. It will really respond to that quite well. Our oak trees, no, it's too much for them. And we found out, too, with maples, it can be too much. If you release it all at once, you're going to shock that tree. Yep. I was talking to Jeff about this, and he said that they found in red maple and sugar maple both that after they had released them on all 4 sides, they actually lost height. And trees got a little bit shorter because it just shocked them so much in the crown that they had some dieback in the top of some of the crowns because of that. So it can really shock those trees, and maple is kind of suspect to that. All right, so looking at, this is based on a 10-year study where they have done some work in the Appalachian region here, and I just highlighted the sugar maple. So this is, in this column right here, so they had some trees that they released and some trees that they did not release, and in the, we'll just focus on sugar maple here. So the unreleased trees in that period grew 1.4 inches in diameter over that 10-year period, whereas the released trees grew at 2 inches. So, 50% increase in growth rates on there. So that gave us more crown, ultimately more sap, and ultimately more syrup out of your all's thing. So it does work. It has been proven, and it has been proven in this area. So here's an aerial view of what this might look like. In this instance, we've got kind of complete release around these. These are our crop trees here, these lighter colored. These dark trees, we're not worrying about them. They're okay. They're not competing with our crop trees. Don't spend your time or effort on them unless they're an invasive species, and then we'd want to get them out of the woods. But then we're just treating the trees that are competing with them. And the nice thing about this practice is it can be done in a wide variety of stand sizes, whether you're talking about small saplings, larger trees, all the way up to saw timber sized trees. We do notice some difference in response rates. As trees get older, their tendency or ability to respond to this release does lessen. But maples will do it up into 60 and 70 years. They can benefit. A maple, especially a sugar maple, can grow almost in the dark. It can really hang out in the shade for a long time. And then when it gets that opportunity to get some sunlight, it can respond to it favorably. When you're doing this, you're thinking about long-term management. You would not want to pick a crop tree that's not likely to last. And we always say till the next time you're going to do a timber harvest. But I would say at least you want a tree that's going to at least give you another 20 years or so. So you wouldn't want to pick crop trees that were, of poor health or poor vigor. And ideally, you'll pick trees that will meet multiple objectives. That's one reason we do a lot of oak management here is because it's so valuable from a timber standpoint, but also from a wildlife standpoint. So a lot of folks are interested in both of those things, revenue and wildlife, and the oaks are just really some of the best species we have to deliver that. Okay, so some guidelines for selecting crop trees in your sugar bush. If you had to choose, and I think there's research would bear out, if you have to pick two crop trees, between two crop trees, and one's a sugar maple and one's a red maple, I would probably go with the sugar maple, all other things being equal, unless you knew something about that individual. Maybe the sap sweetness was a little different. But generally, as a rule of thumb, you'd probably select the sugar maple over. When possible, you want to pick trees that are already up in that upper canopy, or at least competing in that upper canopy, because they're going to be in the best position to respond to that. You want to pick trees that have good branching and vigorous crowns. Again, that's what we're trying to do. We want to pick trees that are going to have a good opportunity to respond to this. And you don't want to pick trees that have problems with them. You know, major forking issues are going to lead to problems down the road when we get ice storms or other issues, rot or extreme cankers or anything like that that makes the tree look unhealthy. You wouldn't want to select that as a crop tree. That'd be probably a good candidate to get out of the woods. Hey, that tool you had was really cool, man. I mean, I don't know how much that cost, but to be able to test that sap right there is pretty impressive. So if you could do that, that would be an ideal thing when you're trying to pick your crop tree. If you could test that sap before you made the investment in killing the surrounding trees, that would be very beneficial. So it's something to really think about. And then again, I want to drive this point home. We're not out there discriminating against everything that's not a maple, you know. If you've got a good white oak or a good yellow poplar in that stand, it's not competing with one of your maple crop trees, leave it alone. It will serve you down the road, and it adds diversity. And certainly, I think diversity is a good thing. It really is. That's one of the great things about our woods, having that much diversity. We are resilient to pests and pathogens that can come through our woods that may select one species. We're seeing that with ash trees. Certainly in north central Kentucky has a predominance of ash trees. The emerald ash borer is coming through there and decimating those stands. And that's a real problem. They don't have as much diversity as we do down here. So the diversity is a good thing. And it's good for a variety of reasons, honestly. Now, I can understand the appeal of having just maple trees in there that you're tapping. That's all you're worrying about. Because it does make things a little bit more efficient for you. No argument there. But there are some problems that I wanted to mention. Suppose we get a defoliator or some other type of insect that comes into the area. You know, if that's all you've got, and that likes maples, guess what? You're going to have some serious problems with that. We see that a lot with urban tree plantings. You know, we recommend that you never plant more than 30% of the same genus in that whole area. We want that diversity, and the same applies in this. Vascular diseases that can cause problems for the trees, you increase your risk of that. Root pathogens that may especially be like sugar maples or other maples, if you will, can be extra problematic when you've got these. And over time, you know, if you've got the same trees that kind of use the same nutrients, or, you know, you can really kind of deplete the soil and the resources in the area if that's all of you got. Those monocultures are not really necessarily the best thing. So a big question you get a lot is, well, how many crop trees should I have? You know, when we start out on a brand new acre of forest land and we've harvested that area, you may see 5,000 to 10,000 tree seedlings come up in that first few years after that. So that's a whole lot. But at the end of that rotation, when we're down to harvesting that area again, you may only have 50 or 60 trees that are actually harvested off of that acre. So just to give you an idea, Mother Nature does a lot of this pruning for us over time. With crop tree management, you all are selecting which trees are going to be those 50 or 60 at the end. Okay, so if you had a brand new stand that was just getting started, this is an area maybe that had been harvested, and you've got tons of little seedlings out there in that 1 to 2 inches, and they're all about the same age, you would try to want to start out with about 200 crop trees. And you're not going to end up with 200, but you want to pick your best 200. And typically you would pick those at about every 15 feet or so. Now, if there's two that are really good and they're 12 feet apart, that's okay. You know, if there's two and they're 17 feet, that's okay too. These are all just general guidelines for you, but about 15 feet apart. And what you want to do is you want to control the trees around that crop tree that are about 3 to 7 feet away from your crop tree. And again, we're doing that just to increase the amount of sunlight on that crop tree. So moving on up to a bigger, but I guess before I do that, let me tell you what diameter. So that 1 to 2 inches, foresters are very lazy. We measure trees right where we can get to them, right at breast height, at about 4.5 feet off the ground. That just makes it easy. So when these diameters I'm talking at about, right about chest height. So we do that. We measure them, and a lot of times you might hear the term DBH, or diameter at breast height. Well, what if there was some kind of deformity on that tree at that height? Then just adjust it right above or just below for that height. So when I'm talking about the diameter, that's what I'm talking about, where you're measuring that at. Okay, so now we're in the same even age stand, but this area has grown up a bit. The trees have gotten a little bit bigger. Now they're in that 3 to 8 inch category. So we're targeting about 100 to 150. Again, if you're at that 3 inch category, you're probably going to be closer to 150. And if you're at the 8 inch, you're going to be closer to the 100 crop trees in that acre. And again, all of these are per acre. Here, again, the spacing about 20 feet apart, getting a little bit further apart as the trees get a little bit bigger. We're going to be removing trees within 5 to 7 feet of that crop tree. And here's where things start getting a little bit, like the Shad was saying, that you got to pay a little bit more attention. Once we get to this size, you don't really want to release that tree all at once. Certainly, you want to take a few years to do that. Probably no more than 2 sides in any year. And see how that tree responds. And if it seems to be responding well, you can maybe come back the next year. If the response is not what you expected, you may wait until that 3rd year to come back and do that rest of that release. Again, there's so much variability in individual trees, but also the sites where they're growing and how they will respond. So that's something you're just going to have to gauge a little bit. But please don't go in there and completely release that tree, because you're going to be disappointed probably in that initial response. All right, so as we get a little bit bigger, 9 to 15 inches, you'll notice our number of crop trees is going down. Now we're at 80 to 100 crop trees per acre. About every 20 to 25 feet, we're looking to select these. Again, since these are natural forests for the most part, they're not going to be perfect on an even grid. So you got to have a little flexibility in your selection there. Again, the same rule applies. You want to keep those competing crowns about 5 to 7 feet away. And the same thing again here. You don't want to release it all at once. Now, as we get bigger and even age stands that are 15 inches in diameter, and we're talking about the average diameter in those trees there. Notice how far that's dropped down. We're down to 35 to 75 crop trees per acre. About every 25 to 30 feet, we're going to pick one. And these, we're picking anything that's kind of competing with that crown around. We want to take those out. And the same thing applies here. Don't do it all at once. So now looking at uneven age stands. Now, many of the stands we have in this part of the state and this part of Kentucky for sure have been, all came up together. Largely they're even age. They may be of different sizes because some trees were a little more productive than their neighbors, but a lot of them are really kind of the same age. But you do have situations where you've got uneven age stands out there, of varying stands. So those we want to look at we're picking trees that are about 6 inches. Ideally, these will be dominant or co-dominant trees if at all possible. And then we're looking around 25 to 50 crop trees per acre. And in this scenario, you're basically selecting the very best you've got to work with, whatever maple that may be, whether it's a box elder or a sugar maple. It's just that best one in that area. Again, removing the competition in 5 to 7 feet around. And in this scenario, if it's one of these upper canopy trees that's been up there for a while, again, you don't want to do that release all at once. You want to spread that out over a few years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we remove some of these competing trees. And I think Shad was mentioning to you some of the problems they had, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. In a perfect scenario, you could be able to have a timber harvest, and they would, you'd work with a good logger, and that logger would be very mindful of the trees that you wanted to retain and not damage those trees that were going to be retained, and you could sell those trees. And you would have a timber harvest so that would return some money to you, but also set you up by releasing your crop trees. If you don't have that option, maybe you don't have enough quantity or quality of trees that are for sale, and then you could look at using them for fuel wood, to maybe heat some of these evaporators or, heat your home if you would. Another option, you can just cut and remove them and just get them out of there. You could just treat them and leave them in place, and we'll talk about different ways to treat and leave those in place in a moment. Exactly. And that's a good segue into my next one. If you are girdling or double girdling, so double girdling on diffuse porous. So Oak trees are ring porous. So if you were to look at a cross section of an oak tree, you would see like a little concentric rings all the way around that tree. But if you get in some of these other species like maple, you don't really see those little rings like that. It's more diffuse porous. So trees that are diffuse porous, we almost have to double girdle those because they can overcome a single girdle pretty. A beech is another example of a tree that really needs a double girdle. An oak tree, you can kill an oak tree real easy. Really, a single girdle around an oak tree will almost kill it without any chemical. But like Shad said, it can be a problem because once you girdle them, and the thing we like about recommending girdling a lot, and that's the main recommendation we do often with crop trees, because you're not dropping trees down that could hit your crop trees, and the trees die slowly over time, creates great wildlife habitat, but you'll start with the finer branches will die, and then the bigger branches slowly die and drop back over time. So it's a kind of a slow decline of that tree. Again, great wildlife habitat. But it does create, if you're in there working or if you got a lot of equipment in there, then that's something you really got to think about. At some point, that tree's going to fall down, and you don't want to be there, and you don't want to lose your lines and all of that. So, I would say again? Oh, yeah. So it's just something you got to be really cautious of. For most of the time when we're doing it, you're not in the woods that often, so it's an okay recommendation. But given Sugarbush and your involvement activity in there, I would almost want to get that tree on the ground if you could, really. If you have that option, I'd like to see it on the ground. If you can't sell it, at least get it on the ground so you're not having to deal with it. But then it's going to be, you're going to have to go over top of it and all kinds of stuff. So this is our website here. We do have a variety of publications and information and videos available to you. And again, ukforestry.org. We've got ink pens out there that have that address on it, so you don't have to write that down. But if you would click, so these are just some of the things. Click on the publications and videos tab there. Thank you. All right, so this is some of the publications and videos you can get. And on the right side under videos, if you would click on controlling unwanted trees and plants in your woodlands. So with the help of our agricultural communications unit at UK, we put together, thank you Dave Stallion and all you all do, we put together a number of videos on different practices. So when you're looking at this publication and it's a suggestion to do a girdle treatment or a hack and squirt treatment or whatever, this is a good, these are like, click on the girdling treatment if you don't mind, and hopefully this will work. And we've posted all these on YouTube. And sound may not be coming, but we do have voiceover on what's going on these. So this is Jeff Stringer talking about how, and lo and behold, what's he getting ready to girdle? A red maple.
Hatchet where you're taking a hatchet and working.
Or is it maybe it's a beech?
The tree, exposing the wood, removing the bark. Oftentimes it's done with a chainsaw, and typically when you do girdle trees with a chainsaw, you'll want to put 2 girdles around the tree. 2 cuts around the tree. You want to make sure that that cut is at least a ½ inch to an inch easily into the tree all the way around it. And so we'll demonstrate that technique now.
What we're trying to do is break up the sap flow of that tree so it'll kill the top of that tree. So we interrupted its plumbing, basically.
Now what you want to do here is make sure that you've got two consistent rings or cuts to where there's no bark that you left standing in there. So the rings all be all the way around there. They all be deep enough to where they cut into the wood. That helps slow the water movement up into the top of the tree. And of course, putting these girdles in here
Let me get back to the PowerPoint. So I just wanted to show y'all one example. So we've got a video on all of these different treatments that you can do, and we've also got one talking about the different chemicals. Really on the chemicals, you really want to make sure that you're using chemicals that are labeled appropriately. And when we talked about herbicides a little bit ago, our gentleman from Kentucky Department of Agriculture was talking about that, organic. So if you're wanting to go organic, you may not be wanting to use any chemicals out there in your woods, you know. And honestly, I'm not sure of what all the requirements are or what limitations as far as from a maple syrup standpoint, organic, which are allowed and which aren't allowed, but that's something you'd want to investigate before you start putting chemicals in. Also, you're dealing with a food source too, so you got to be careful, you know, you don't want to contaminate your food source as well. So again, when you're questioning how to go about this, please check out those videos, and there's other publications and references on there that you can quickly get to. Okay, a few other things to think about when we're managing our sugar bush. Pruning. You know, oftentimes we don't recommend pruning just because it doesn't end up paying for itself in time unless you're dealing in a plantation setting, and then you can make it justifiable. However, you know, if you're thinking about long-term, you're going to work with these trees for a while, if they've got some bad forking, like if they're terminal forking, you got two branches right at the top, you might want to prune one of those out. Oh, sorry about that. You might want to just prune one out so you know, so you're just got one. Sorry. Yeah, that's great. All right. Or if the branches are in your way. You know, if there's a branch that's causing you a problem, it's okay to prune it. The thing is, we want to do it at the right time, either late winter or early summer if you're doing some light pruning. And then this is a nice little diagram. You can do some damage if you prune at the wrong time or if you prune incorrectly. So this is off the Arbor Day Foundation's website. And really what you want to do is, most of the time you'll probably be pruning live branches. You want to make that first cut something up in there, and you want to do that a little higher up of where you're going to cut it. And the ideal here is if you were to go ahead and just do this straight cut across through here, there's a chance that as that branch comes down, it could pull the bark all the way down with it. So you want to eliminate that possibility. So if you're going to do that, you want to make sure you're doing it the right way and be careful with that. The other thing I want to point out, a lot of times people think you got to kind of cut it flush, like there, like C to X. You don't want to cut that because you're really cutting into the part of the tree that's going to respond and heal up over that. We call that the branch collar. So you want to see wherever that branch changes from bark on the edge to branch bark, that's where you'd want to make that cut. So just wanted to point that out real quick. We talked a little bit about soil testing, you know, whether you should go in, and soil testing would lead you into, do you want to lime or you want to fertilize? And there's been a lot of discussions about that, and when I was trying to prepare for this presentation, I found some kind of conflicting reports on that. You know, as far as my recommendation to be soil tested and see what you got. You know, from a pH standpoint, maples like really 5.5 to 7 or so. So that's if you're outside of that range, you may not even have maples there in the first place. And then from a fertilization standpoint, if you're just going to fertilize without soil testing at all, the recommendations, at least out of that book, are just a 10-10-10. And I can't remember how much it was per 100 square feet, maybe a pound or so per 100 square feet. So if you're interested in trying to increase productivity through that, I would first recommend that you do a soil test. Also, another option would be some nutrient analysis of the leaves to make sure that they've got the right amount of nutrients in them. So that would be another kind of testing that you would want to do. I'd hate to see you kind of waste your money and it not really pay off for you. So that's something I would use with a little caution, to be honest. Don't go out there indiscriminately soil testing and liming without knowing what you're doing and targeting a certain level. Okay, so some of the things protecting the sugar bush I want to talk about. Wildfire. Oh, Lord, we've had some bad wildfires here. We really have. It's been tough. And, you know, not only could they wipe out your tubing and your other stuff in the trees, but they can now kill your trees. And a lot of times the fires we have here are not crown fires, so the trees will leaf out the next year. They're just ground fires, but a lot of times those ground fires will damage the bark of the tree and the cambium of the tree, which will probably interfere with sap flow, at least in certain parts. I don't know if it would mess with taste, or weren't you all talking about that a little bit earlier? But, yeah, I'm not sure of that. They may have some idea on that. Did y'all do anything on any fire-scarred trees? Okay. Might be something to see if there's another reason maybe we can stop wildfires. But really the best bet is having a good management plan for your property, fire breaks in your property, and working with a forester can allow you to get that. You certainly wouldn't want livestock in there. They're damaging to trees without a doubt, and I'm sure they'd probably love to plow through your tubing as well. I should have added coyotes to this after hearing this morning's talk. But really what I'm thinking more about is the individual trees. So if you've got some small maple trees in there that you're trying to kind of be your next crop trees, I'm thinking more about protecting the trees as opposed to your maple syrup infrastructure there. And so we're talking about things like tree shelters. These are small little basically plastic tubes that we can put around trees to protect them from this predation. And if it's a bigger area, you can think about some fencing. And in hunting, if you've gotten a lot of pressure in there, some hunting may help reduce that pressure if you're getting a lot of predation on your maple trees. Generally would discourage the use of poisons or any other repellents. You don't have a lot of control on who gets that. Maybe it's the grandkids or somebody else that gets in there, or maybe it's some Fido that ends up getting a hold of it. So, and the effectiveness can really not always be there. So probably would discourage you from putting poisons and repellents out there. A lot of times people think about homemade repellents like cayenne pepper and other things like that. We did a great webinar the other night talking about that, and you can watch. We have a bunch of pre-recorded webinars on our website too that you can see, and one was on wildlife damage. Dr. Matt Springer, is our wildlife professor, was talking about that, and a lot of times these things don't end up working that well and end up being more expensive than you thought in the first place. So use some caution with that. Insects and diseases, really you need to know what you've got. There's a number of different insects and diseases that we have out there that can cause problems, but you want to get the treatment that's appropriate for what you're dealing with. So I would encourage you to work through your county extension agent. If they don't know, and most of them know many of these, they do have resources at the university that they can tap into. You want to get a feel for how bad the infestation levels are. And then you got to make a determination. If it's not an acceptable loss that you're going to be experiencing from there, then you're going to come up with a treatment plan. And your county agents can help you navigate that, or your forester can help you navigate that. And then ultimately, I'd like to encourage you, if you are a landowner here in Kentucky and Virginia as well, even though I don't have the Virginia pamphlet, get a forest stewardship plan. Your woods are an important asset. You're paying taxes for them. You're responsible for them. Why not get the most out of them? So the plan will help you find out what you have, including maple resources. You'll get an inventory of your property. Now, they won't measure every single tree, but they will assess the stand for you, and they can give you some good information. And they can let you know if you've got problems or other issues on your property. And ultimately, they have a lot of technical assistance, so they can help you pick crop trees. So if you're not sure, they can help you identify your maple trees on your property. They can help give you practices and show you what would work best to control trees that are competing with them. And oftentimes, if you're enrolled in some of these programs, there is cost share money available. I'm talking about farm bill programs, money that helps landowners implement conservation practices. And again, many times these will be for whatever your objectives are. If maple syrup production, that could be one of those. So that's a good program. I do have a number of these that you can check out, please. And it's a good one to get a hold of. All right, so at the beginning of my presentation, I told you I pulled some stats from the U.S. Forest Service, and if you're interested, this is kind of the website where it comes from. eValidator, it's freely available to everybody. Again, the state agencies work with the U.S. Forest Service to do a continuous inventory of all the forests in the United States, and here in Kentucky, every 5 years, the entire state is done. And so they basically, the way they do that, they put out plots, they lay a grid over the state, and they drop in each 6,000 hectagon one plot, randomly located within that. And if that's a forested plot, then they find out who the owner is, and if that owner will allow them access, then they will inventory that property over time in perpetuity. And so they've been doing that for a while, so we've got good data. But again, anything with statistics, you can get it to say about whatever you want, and this is not a complete inventory. So some of this may not make sense to you, but this is just based on that. So my question would be, if you know of a better data source, please tell me, because this is the best one I know of as far as trying to get a handle on what we've got. So what I did, and I pulled it from 2-inch age classes up to 41 inches. So I looked and I said, give me every different species of tree that we have, and then I summarized those basically based on tapping guidelines, and we'll see that in a minute, how many taps you can put in different size trees. So I did that, and these are some of the numbers for sugar maple right here. So if you look at just Harlan County right here, they had a total of Sugar maples that were 9 inches or greater, over 1 million of them was the estimate there. Letcher, 915,000, and Wise County, 489,000. Again, this is an estimate based on how that was gathered, but it is the best available information that I'm aware of, and if you know of better, please tell me, because I'd like to know it. And then we can look here in the different age classes or size classes that I broke down. So I've done this for each of those 3 species we talked about. Look at those numbers, jumped up a lot on red maple there. 2 million down in Harlan County, 1.3 million in Wise, and 1.7 in Letcher County, where we're at right now. And then it shows you the distribution as far as those, and again, I just summarized those for us. And then here's box elder. Apparently, y'all don't have any in Wise County, you know, so obviously we know it's not true. What that means is any of the plots that were in Wise County didn't contain box elders, all that means. And same thing for Harlan County, because I know they're there as well. And I also did that for silver maple and for black maple, mountain maple, and striped maple. And I think all of those were basically really small. We had some of them, but they were less than 9 inches. So just wanted to do a little theoretical playing here, and I think this plays in really nice with your all's talk about the potential to form an association, especially in this region. So I wanted to do, so this is all sugar, red, and box elder in these 3 counties. So I went through and I just summarized from each of those. So at least in the 9, and I should have gave you a total column there, sorry about that. Let's see, about 8 million thereabouts, total trees in sugar maple, red maple, and box elder in the region. And then looking at tapping guidelines, and I know these can vary a little bit. Sometimes I've read that you wouldn't want to tap below 10 inches, and I've heard 9 inches and 8, but the way the size classes came, I tried to just get it as close as I could. So if we assume we could put 1 tap in all of these trees, 2 taps in all of those trees, 3 taps there, 4 taps there, then that can give us some idea of how many potential taps. Now, that means we're tapping every tree, which ain't going to happen, but there's a lot of potential taps. You know, look at that, almost 10 million taps in the region of these 3 counties. So again, that's a lot. That's a whole lot, really. And if you look at the ownership, obviously some of those are on land that you wouldn't be able to have access in, but in our counties around here, we're about 80% privately owned. So these are people just like yourselves, you know, so the majority of these are going to be on private property, and I would think would be eligible for tapping. So, well, folks, thank you all for your time and attention. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's an exciting thing. You know, maple syrup is wonderful, as you all well know, so I wish you a lot of luck, and certainly thank Shad and Jeremy and Phil for taking the leadership and bringing this school together. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. So, thank you all.